We're talking this afternoon with Beatrice Muhlfelder, who is recording her testimony concerning the Holocaust for Temple Sinai in Summit, New Jersey. So good afternoon, Bea.
Good afternoon to you.
So, will you take us back to your place of birth and your date of birth, please?
We'll get the date of birth over with first. That'll answer all kinds of questions. I was born on September 13th, 1927, in a town called Konstanz in German, Lake Constance in English. A small, very old town divided by the Rhine River into the German section and the Swiss section, so that I could walk from my house to Switzerland in about 5 minutes. In order to go to the rest of the town, I had to cross the Rhine River and walk quite a distance to where I got my first English lessons, where I learned that a W was not two U's put together. I remember that clearly. I couldn't understand what a W was if it wasn't two U's. What was more important than the geography was the fact that you needed a passport to go to Switzerland, which was very important later on in the story. But you did not need a passport to go across the bridge. That geography made all the difference between life and death to many people.
And who was in your family, in your immediate family?
We lived in a house adjacent, that's the accent, to the synagogue. It was my father and my mother, and my brother, who was 15 years older than I, and who left Germany at my father's suggestion in 1933.
And your brother's name?
My brother's name in German was Sigbert, good old German name, translated later into Bert when he came to the United States. And he came to live with an aunt in South Orange, New Jersey.
Okay. And can you tell us something about your parents' occupations?
My father was a cantor and a teacher of Jewish history, Bible, and he did all the singing in the services. And in 1933, when my rabbi left for Israel, he also took over the rabbinic duties. My mother was a good German housewife, German Jewish housewife, and was a big help to my father in his cantorial duties.
And what was the nature of Jewish practice in this synagogue? Was this Reform or Orthodox? What would you say?
It was what we called liberal. It's still liberal. It's somewhere between Reform and conservative. Mm-hmm. It was a little bit mixed up because it was modern enough to have an organ, but men and women sat separately. The women sat upstairs and the men sat downstairs. And the children sat downstairs.
And did you go, what kind of a school did you go to?
A German public school, all girls, which I visited again on my more recent trips and looked exactly the same way it did when we left Germany in 1938.
And did you have friends among your schoolmates?
I had friends, both Jewish and non-Jewish. I remember well twin girls who lived very near me, who came to visit all the time. And then at some point, stopped coming altogether. I remember asking for them many times, and I don't remember what I was told why they weren't coming anymore. And in retrospect, I must assume that it was because I was Jewish.
How old were you at that time when that split happened, would you say?
maybe 36,
So
give
you
or
would
take.
have been a young teenager?
No, no, I was.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I came when I was 10,
Right.
so or just short of 10.
So you were,
I was
okay.
probably 7 or something
right.
like that.
All right. And do you have any particular recollections about the town of Constance?
Constance is very old, very well known in all of Europe. It's a tourist town. You can see the Alps from the bridge. I don't remember particular anti-Semitism as far as I was concerned. I know my mother had a friend who had a daughter my age. The mother was sick, and the daughter played with me a lot, was at my house a lot because the mother was sick. And one day my mother came home and said she was really upset because this girl, whose name I don't remember, had seen her coming toward her and crossed the street so she wouldn't have to say hello to her. That must have been in the late 30s. When we visited Germany in 1986, there was a message at the hotel that a gentleman wanted to see us, and he was going to be there at 6 o'clock. I didn't recognize the name, and I had no idea what he would want. He came and said that his girlfriend, who was sick, couldn't come, but she had remembered that she had crossed the street so she wouldn't have to say hello to my mother. And she wanted to know if we could forgive her, or if I thought that my mother would have forgiven her. And that was all those years later, and she had not forgotten what she had done, which I found so interesting.
And what did you answer to that?
I said, without hesitation, I said, my mother would have forgiven you. I didn't add that I wasn't sure that I could, but I know my mother would have.
Was there evidence of anti-Semitism at that time in the schools, in the town, besides being avoided or a friend somehow disappearing from your life? Was there other evidence of anti-Semitism?
No, it's really interesting. When I think back, I'm always amused. I was a child, and it was traditional in Germany that if a teacher came in to say hello to your teacher, or there was some communication, the whole class got up and said Heil Hitler. And the teacher took me aside one day and said that I had to get up, but I didn't have to say Heil Hitler. And I was almost felt deprived as being singled out. So I have no idea. I have tried so hard to remember if I was ever really aware, maybe even after the temple was destroyed, that what did I understand? What was I told? What was I not told? I know that my mother tried very hard not to scare me. She didn't say those twins can't come to play with you anymore because you're Jewish. You don't say that to a child. So it's very difficult for me to place at what point I became aware of how serious this was.
When did the Nazis come to power or enter your town?
That's hard to answer. I remember very early on, maybe in 1933, I had seen a picture of that march. The Nazis marched through part of Constance, and I remember my mother taking my hand and taking me across the border, which was so close, into Switzerland. But I remember, I can close my eyes and remember where I saw that march. And whenever I've gone back, whenever I get to that area, I relive that moment when I saw those brown shirts marching.
And how did you feel when you saw them?
I was probably just interested or confused, or I'm not sure that at that point, 1933, I was, 6? Probably 5 or 6. I don't know exactly what I brought to that except surprise. I probably could feel my mother's reaction, which was obviously altogether different.
And so in April of 1933, when boycotts of Jewish businesses began, book burnings, I mean, was there any evidence of that in Constance that early?
Not that I remember.
Or restrictions on your life in any way?
I know there were all kinds of activities that I participated in that stopped. Like my mother would take me to the school at night, sometimes for gym lessons, and that stopped along with the twins. But I don't know exactly when that was.
So when did things change in a dramatic way, or did they in this town, in the synagogue?
I don't know if attitudes in the town changed so much that I was aware. But of course the big change came, my awareness came the night the synagogue was destroyed. Not externally, but internally. I was in my bedroom, which faced the synagogue, and I heard this loud crash during the night, but I paid no attention. And then in the morning, I heard people in the street yelling, "The synagogue is burning, the synagogue is burning." And it wasn't really burning, it was just smoke. The Nazis had come in and placed all the Torahs on the beamer, doused them with some sort of chemical, and set that on fire, which created smoke, and they threw over the pews, and we had beautiful candelabras, which you can probably see in the picture that's in the Holocaust Museum, in our Holocaust Museum. And so there was no fire, there was just this tremendous smoke. And I remember going next door, and the firefighters were trying to put out whatever they thought were flames, but weren't. And I sat on the curb with my friend Peter Guggenheim, who lived across the street, and we watched all what that was going on. I can't say that I remember my feelings. I suspect I was confused. I don't know how much else there was. It was the whole town, it seemed, had come to watch what was going on. And at the end, this Peter Guggenheim's father, who was my pediatrician, went into the building and rescued one of the Torahs, which he took across the street and put in his house. Years later, when they left for the United States, they called me over, and they lived on the second floor. And I was, 9 years old then, and they gave me this full-size Torah to take home to my house.
Wow.
So I carried the Torah down all the stairs of their house, across the street, and up 2 flights of stairs to my house, to see my horrified mother with this little girl with this big Torah. But I think that's why I always have a sort of special connection when I see a Torah. I think that was a very long answer.
That's just fine, because we want as much information as you can recall. So was that on Kristallnacht?
This was in 1936. Kristallnacht happened in 38.
Right.
So this was when, I don't know if it was the first synagogue that was destroyed. And the theory then, I don't know whether it's ever proven, that it was not locals who did this, that there had been some Nazi conference or convention in the area, and that there was people from there. The fire department could not have been more helpful. Mm-hmm. People of the town were very supportive. So I could go along with this. It was not a local happening.
What happened after the synagogue was burned in terms of worship and having a place to worship?
I don't remember.
Was
I
it
was
so?
never asked that. I've never thought about it.
Was it damaged totally?
Oh,
the
totally.
synagogue?
Totally gutted.
So, but you don't recall if there were services held elsewhere or what happened?
I do not recall. There must have been a place, maybe it was the house I lived in on the second floor. The first floor was a community center. I don't remember. That's interesting.
I forgot to ask you your parents' names, so would you just put
My
those in now?
My father's name was Jacob Brafman, and my
your-
mother was Flora.
Flora? Okay. So, did anything happen in Constance in 1938 at Kristallnacht?
I
or
wasn't there.
You had left already.
We left in August, and Kristallnacht happened in
So, August
38.
1938. Do you
Yep.
remember the date in August?
No, but it's probably in my passport, which
All
is
right.
in the exhibit.
And so, was the decision made to leave gradually, or was it discussed? What do you recall?
Well, I know that my father insisted that my brother leave Germany in 1933, right at the beginning. And I had an aunt in South Orange, which is where he went to live. I forgot the question.
About was there discussion
so
about
my father
leaving?
decided that my brother would leave immediately, or as immediately as possible, because he said that if anything was going to get really bad, that they would come and get the young men first, which is exactly what happened.
So then it was your parents and yourself.
The rabbi left for Israel in 1934, maybe, really early. My father felt that he had to stay with the congregation, and when he finally decided that he had to get his family, his wife and daughter out, we got an affidavit to make sure that we wouldn't become a public charge. Those words seem familiar today. And they started the procedure, and then when we finally were ready to leave, there were members of the congregation who would not come to say goodbye because he was leaving his congregation. But sometimes you have to make the tough choices.
So was there a moment that the family, your father said, now is when we leave, or tonight, or when?
It
How
wasn't
did that
one
happen?
of these rush things.
Okay.
It was, they put the paperwork into process, and they waited for whatever had to be worked out, and then we went to Stuttgart.
I just want to ask you one question. Did you need permission to leave Germany? Did you need a document that gave you permission? Do you
They were
recall?
very happy to get rid of us.
Okay.
The permission had to come from the United States.
To come in.
To
Yeah,
come in.
yeah.
People are under the misapprehension that it was hard to get out. It wasn't hard to get out. It was hard to get in, at least at that time.
So you left Constance and went to Stuttgart, did you say?
I got to Stuttgart to get our affidavit,
right.
whatever that permission thing was.
Right.
Now, we left from Constance. We got onto the train station, was very near to our house. So we got on the train in Constance, went into Kreuzlingen, which was the first city, right, like West Orange is to Livingston. That's how Kreuzlingen was to Constance, with a border in between. And we got off, had our passport, I remember that too, had our passports stamped as we left Germany and as we entered Switzerland. all in a matter of maybe 3 or 4 minutes. Got off the train, and we were in Switzerland.
And do you remember what feelings you had at that time when you arrived in Switzerland?
No. No, I guess I was happy. I was with my parents. I was a child, and we went to France. I wasn't unlike other times we hadn't gone by train. We just walked across. But the location of Constance was vital in my parents' ability to help people. I guess the word is smuggle people into Switzerland at night. I remember very often that at dinner there would be a strange-looking man with a beard and a black coat and a black hat and have dinner with us, and in the morning he'd be gone. And it was later that I learned that there was a tiny stream, and my parents would, as did many other congregants, help people across the border during the nighttime because the Swiss were not very welcoming.
So, but your parents were active then in helping people get out.
Oh, yeah. While we're on that subject, I remember vividly, since my father was the cantor and sort of the bookkeeper, we had all kinds of records in the house. I think probably some donations to socialist, who knows, maybe even communist organizations. And I remember my mother spending a week, probably more, in the laundry in the basement, down in an alley where the laundry was done, burning the books that they were afraid would show up and be a problem, which leads me to the fact that I remember one night some men in black uniforms, boots up to their knees and those hated caps, who went through some of the records and books that my parents had to make sure that they were not subversive. They did not touch us. They were not friendly, but they weren't rude, if I remember correctly. But they certainly invaded our space.
So, were there relatives who were left behind, who could not get papers, who could not get out? Were there grandparents or aunts and uncles, cousins?
I think that by the time we left, only my mother's stepmother was still in Europe, and they had made provision for her in a old age home. I don't know what we call those these days. So she was taken care of. I think that's the only one of my mother's, on my mother's side. And my father's side, one brother had come very early, and I think he was the only one who survived. Except I had my cousin, who's still alive, was part of a children's transport to England. But I think everybody else in my father's family perished. Whereas in my husband's family, I think everybody got out. Mm-hmm. Just the way things went.
So, taking you back to Switzerland.
I'd like that.
What was then the route and the means to emigrate to the United States?
We stayed in Switzerland and Kreuzlingen, I guess, a week or so, and then took the train, I think, through Milan and Cherbourg, where we boarded the boat. As far as I can remember, that was the route.
Mm-hmm. And then took a boat from Cherbourg to the United States?
To Hoboken.
Where did you come into port?
Hoboken.
Into Hoboken?
Not through Ellis
Right.
Island.
Well, that was later. And so what happened then?
Then we got off the boat. I didn't see the Statue of Liberty, at least not that I remember. We got off the boat and got into my aunt's chauffeur-driven limousine, which made a Hudson car. That takes me back. I thought that in the United States probably everybody got picked up by a chauffeur. It didn't turn out that way. But I remember that on the way to South Orange, on that first trip, my mother got all excited because she was looking out the window and she saw a clothesline with laundry on it. And she was so happy that in America people that hung things on clotheslines. Now they don't, but then they did.
But then they did. And where did you settle?
Newark. And we stayed with my aunt, one of my aunts who had come earlier, who lived in Newark, looked for an apartment that we could share. And so we were in South Orange until that apartment was ready, and then we moved to Newark.
And you went to public school then in Newark?
They started me in kindergarten. And it was this big girl with all the little kids, and the teacher asked me what I was doing there because I spoke no English, and I must somehow or other have gotten across that I didn't speak English. This was in '38, so it was relatively recent development to have refugee people in public schools.
And then what happened? Did you learn English quickly?
I learned English quickly, and one of the things that helped my family speak English quickly is because we were at war with Germany. You couldn't speak German. Now you walk around the city and you hear all kinds of languages. In those days you didn't want to be caught speaking German. And so you were forced to speak English. My mother, who learned English slowly because she was at home. I think that's still the role of women. They stay home and the men learn English quickly, if people are interested in learning. I'm trying to think. There was something that was connected with the language. I can't think of it now. I'll come back to it if I think of it.
What was it
like?
like?
My mother used to write letters to my brother every night. My brother was in the United States Army by then. But my mother would write to him every night, in English. And people would say, but you don't know how to speak English well. And she'd say, he'll understand and he'll get a good laugh and he can probably use a good laugh. So every night.
That was good. So how was it for you in public school, being a big girl put in kindergarten? And
it didn't last long.
And then when they put you at an appropriate grade level, what was it like with the other kids? How did you feel?
Oh, that's what I wanted to say when I said I couldn't remember. They would not, my classmates, some of my classmates would not believe that I was Jewish because I was German. And I would say, but you're Jewish, and you know, you're American, you're Jewish, and I'm Jewish. I could be German and Jewish. But I couldn't get that across. I always found that strange.
Was it comfortable, uncomfortable for you as you got into your teenage years and so on?
I can't tell you what it would have been, but certainly, as if I can judge correctly, that I had no more trouble or less trouble being a teenager than I would have anywhere else.
It can be hard for people coming from another country, regardless of the circumstances, to feel sometimes belonging, a sense of belonging. I'm just wondering if the emigration carried any of that for you.
the answer of being integrated, if you want to be integrated. If you want to be integrated, from my experience, it's the language that makes the difference. And kids learn language quickly in school.
So, as you look back now, Bea, from a very distinguished age, how do you think it all impacted you? And can you share some of your reflections from your perspective of today?
From the fact that I have been, certainly all my married life, so interested in telling the story. Having been married to a man who was in Germany on Kristallnacht, whose synagogue was destroyed. We have both been very active in trying to be part of the people who tell the story. For me, what's a little different is that when I was contacted in 1986 by Constance to come visit, I opened the letter, I opened the invitation, I said to my husband, "Oh, I'm invited." Berlin started this program of asking people to come back. I said, I was invited to come back to Constance. And he said, "I'm not going." And I said, "I'm going." And I had no hesitancy at all. I told my son Danny that I'd been invited, and Daddy doesn't want to go, but I do. And he said, "You're not going alone, I'm going with you." And my daughter Leslie said, "You can't go with Danny and you, I'm going with you." And Barry, who's on the West Coast, for whatever reason couldn't go, so the three of us went. And met with this Professor Wien, and that's a whole unbelievable story, which at the end I will tell if you're interested. But we established this friendship. This is a couple the non-Jewish couple who lived as Jews in Constance. He was a professor at the University of Constance. And the relationship grew, which, as I said, is a long story. But it started a connection with Constance, which as of about 10 o'clock this morning has continued in various ways. I don't know whether I should go into what the Stolperstein is.
You can explain that. I think that would be helpful.
There's an artist. It's interesting that so few Jews in this country know about this because it's such an interesting project. This German artist's name is Gunther Demnig. Right. Started a project whereby a brass stone, maybe 4 inches square, is placed in front of a house in which a Jew who was impacted by the Holocaust lived. So in front of my house, there are 4 Stolpersteine for the Brafman family and several others for other people who lived in the house. A Stolperstein means a stumbling stone. Mm-hmm. The idea being it produced what's the word that when something sticks out a little? Protrude. Say that again? Protrude. Thank you very much. So you stumble over it and you look at the name on that stone. The meaning that on that stone it says why the person left, whether they survived and where they are. And maybe not where they are. As long as a name is remembered, the person is not forgotten. That is the feeling behind it. By now he has placed, I don't know how many thousands of these, almost all of them by himself. And I had met him maybe when our stones were placed. I met him and we sort of established some contact. And the last time we went, when I met him, I said, you know, we have a Holocaust Remembrance Center. Would it be possible to make me an extra copy of my stone so that the synagogue would have it? And he complied, and it is now also in the exhibit. This is a project that has now gone into, I forgot how many cities.
And countries. They're doing it in Czechoslovakia as well.
They even did some in Switzerland, which really amazed me. I think I had been back now several times to place a stone for the synagogue, which is, to me, a sad tale. I'll go into that. The place where the synagogue stood on Kristallnacht, 1938, when they tried to destroy the synagogue, it was so sturdy and so secure that they had to dynamite it. And after the war, this Mr. Nissenbaum and his family, who were displaced persons, came to Konstanz. Somehow or other had made some money. And the town, because it didn't expect any Jews to return, let him have or buy that plot of land, on which he built a big, modern-looking bank, which absolutely horrified everybody. It's one of the few places in Germany where what turned out to be a commercial building replaced the synagogue. Mm-hmm. And he built what he called a private synagogue in the basement and on the first floor, which was his own private synagogue. And when we went back in '86, they were very possessive of the fact that this was theirs, and we were visitors, and we were not particularly welcome. Is that right, Leslie?
I would say that's right. It reveals the complexities of these.
But as of, to finish that sad story, which upset everybody to know that this sacred ground was not kept, but this coming November 10th, in other words, next week, a new building, not in the same spot, but down the street, will be rededicated for the first time. It was just finished being built and will be dedicated, and I hope to get some of the material that will be used during that.
Are there Jews in Konstanz today?
There are Jews in Konstanz. There are two comparative Orthodox congregations which don't seem to get along very well with each other, which tells me that we have learned very little. But it makes me happy to know that there is now a place that's called a synagogue.
Well, it's an interesting story to hear. Would you like to consult your notes to see if there's anything I haven't asked you that you'd like to include in the testimony?
It's the episode with when my brother was still in Germany. We never had a radio, obviously no television. And my brother, who was then probably around 20, came home one day with a radio. He and a friend of his had made a radio, construct a radio, which he very proudly plugged in and played. And timing was such that it was Hitler ranting and raving, which I sort of relive very frequently these days with the crowd shouting things that I didn't want to hear. But anyhow, my mother heard this Hitler voice, and she said, "Get that," in German, "get that radio out of here." We never had another radio.